All right, we'll give about 30 seconds before we start. All right, I see some more people trickling in, so a couple more seconds. All right, let's get started on this webinar. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on data-driven sustainability, transforming the built environment for a greener tomorrow. So in this webinar, we'll be talking about sustainability data related to commercial real estate. So why data is important, how do we gather the sustainability data, what are some key metrics to look for, and then what do we do with this data? So this topic has been very heavily discussed, and I know a lot of you who's in the audience have heard people talk about sustainability data or have participated in conferences and other sessions on sustainability data, and it's come up often again and again. But this solidifies the fact that the processes on obtaining and reporting sustainability data is still an issue. So this webinar is intended to provide some insights on sustainability data from some of our leading sustainability experts at RETEC. All right, next slide. So before we begin, please mute your microphones. I think everyone's already muted, but in case you accidentally turn that on, mute that back. And then closed captioning is provided. We are recording this webinar, so a recording will be provided after the presentation is over. And then please use the Zoom Q&A box to send us questions. So there's a box down there, so type in your questions throughout and we'll address them at the end of the webinar. So this webinar is a panelist discussion. So we'll spend about the majority of the time going through some questions, and then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for the audience. So next slide. So before we jump in, just to give everyone a quick intro to RETEC Advisors, for those of you who are not familiar, we are a sustainability advisory firm. We provide a lot of varying services from sustainability program strategy, development and implementation, data management and analytics, climate solution services, reporting, compliance. We help with green building certifications. A lot of the work is focused around commercial real estate, but we do provide services in other industries as well. And one of the main things that we focus on is data. So, we're always on a never-ending quest to capture as much data as possible, and also as clean and accurate as possible for our clients. So I think this is a very relevant topic for us to speak on today. Next slide. So I'll start with the introductions and I can pass it on to the panelists after that. We do have a quick fun fact question for everyone to answer and the panelists. So the question is, what is one sustainable practice that you do in your daily life? So to start, well, I'll give everyone some time to think. I'll start. I'm the head of market research and innovation here at RETEC, and my focus is on data platforms, strategic partnerships. So I'll be moderating this panel. And my sustainable practice is, I think, to keep it simple, changing the light bulbs in my house to LEDs as they burn out. So next, I'll pass it on to Brenna.
So much, John. Appreciate it. Great to be with you. I'm Brenna Walraven, Executive Strategic Advisor. I'm the newest addition to the RETEC team, and I'm thrilled to be with you today. I help oversee client support, but also support kind of the overall execution for RETEC around strategy, education, training, engagement, et cetera. But again, honor and privilege to be with you. And my fun fact answer is I'm kind of maniacal on recycling in my daily life, but I also have had solar since 2004. So I think I'm double dipping, but that's my game plan.
That's good. Jonathan?
I am Jonathan Suarez. I'm the Director of Sustainability Services. I'm a little bit on the back end from sometimes the client facing, but really hoping to help our teams to onboard clients, look at collecting quality data, doing data quality reports that also influence our reporting and compliance frameworks, which also roll up underneath me to really help to give the appropriate information to our client teams. So what do I do as a in my daily practice of life, really right now I'm focused on helping my kids understand how to reduce waste and how waste impacts the environment. So they're really educational, from even just, hey, I ate all my food today, to, hey, Dad, can I recycle this? Can I not? Some of those simple components. So start them when they're young, so they understand how it impacts the environment as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Fluence. I am the head of sustainability reporting and frameworks at RETEC. So I oversee all of our work around reporting and disclosure mechanisms such as GRESB, the Principles for Responsible Investment, or PRI, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, and then also regulatory requirements such as the SEC's new rule on climate-related disclosure and the EU's Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or SFDR. So my sustainability fun fact is that I've been working on removing all plastics from my health and wellness routines. So it takes a little while as I've been waiting for some things to run out, but then trying to find replacements for those that I like that are plastic free. So it's been a journey for sure.
Hi, I'm Brady Mills. I'm head of climate risk technical services at RETEC. I'm responsible for the technical execution of our climate risk related services. So for transition risk, that includes things like greenhouse gas emissions inventories and decarbonization work related to building performance standards and CREM. And then on the physical risk side, that's evaluating portfolios and properties for climate hazards and then planning property resilience. Jonathan, in relation to your fun fact, my daughter recently didn't know where our recycling bin was, so I hope that's more of a comment on my parenting than our sustainability practices. And then my sustainable practice, it's not daily, but monthly. I do benchmark my energy and water emissions or water use in Energy Star Portfolio Manager. I'm proud to say that my house has a score of 75, but looking to improve that over time. Thank you.
That's a very fun fact. I didn't even know you can benchmark your own house. Maybe I'll start doing that too. All right, yeah, as everyone can see, we have a group of professionals with varying experiences from different departments. So I thought each one of them could provide their own unique view and look at sustainability data and where they have been practicing and evaluating those type of data sets. So, but before we jump into the questions, we have a quick poll from the audience. And so just curious on the audience participating here today, what is your biggest issue and obstacle that you have with sustainability data? So if you have a quick second to choose, we have some options here. Just wondering where everyone's biggest pain point is. One is obtaining data. Second is performing data quality checks and making sure data collected is accurate, coming up with meaningful metrics using that data, using the data to track your progress, estimating missing data, and then how to use the data to drive action. So if you can take a quick moment and choose which one your biggest, most highest level issue. That's it. All right, I think let's see, hopefully everyone has voted. So can we see the results of this poll? Oh, there we go. So it looks like majority is saying how to use the data to drive action. Interesting, okay. And then performing data quality checks and making sure data collection next, obtaining data. Awesome. Yeah, well, hopefully this webinar will help, at least provide some insights to some of these issues. I wouldn't say complete solutions. If we had all the answers, I guess we wouldn't be here talking about it. So hopefully some insights and providing some of our expertise on some of these different issues and obstacles. So let's get started. All right, so to start the questions, for this webinar, why are we here? Why are we talking about data? So the question around this is, why is it important to track sustainability data? And what are some of the risks and issues, if you don't track sustainability data? So let's pass it around and go around the room with each one of you. Let's start with Brenna.
Thanks much. Yeah, I think the old adage is really true. You can't manage what you don't measure. And so to really understand your performance, and I mean, not just environmentally, but also financially, you need to develop kind of decision useful data, metrics, and tracking methodologies. And so the risks include, and I know the team's going to talk about a lot of different ones, but the one that comes to mind is that we're missing opportunities to improve. And that means we're missing opportunities to not only save money, but reduce risk. And cost is one metric that organizations typically focus on, which of course is important. But I think consumption, intensities, Energy Star scores all give us additional insights to how assets, portfolios, funds, and the overall organization is performing.
Anyone else want to chime in? Brady?
Yeah, I mean, I was hoping that I was going to get to be the person to say you can't manage what you don't measure, but Brenna beat me to it. I was going to try to see if I could have the most data-related cliches in this in this discussion. But yeah, building on what Brenna said, I kind of think of it as understanding your exposure to risks. And obviously, I think most of the stuff that I say today is going to be through the lens of climate risks, because that's what I focus on. So having the data to understand, which of your properties are predicted to face BPS fines and when, and knowing when you need to take actions and make decisions about how to avoid those. And then a similar thing on the physical risk side. So a big part is kind of understanding your exposure. And then I guess kind of getting back to the poll question, which is, knowing what next steps to take. I think having good data enables you to make the best decisions about how to improve your climate risk over time. So like, obviously you wouldn't want to perform an ASHRAE energy audit on every single property that you own. You'd want to make sure that you were targeting the ones that needed it most. So having that good data is what really enables you to get the most bang for your buck, and targeting maybe more thorough surveys or looking at where to invest in making those improvements.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. Using that data to drive action is one of the main pieces. Is like, if you don't collect it, then how do you know which action to take? So definitely agree from that perspective. And Katie, what about you from a reporting perspective, from your framework, from your lens, in terms of like the framework works that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Data is the foundation of almost all of both the voluntary and the mandatory ESG reporting frameworks. Particularly top of mind right now is the new SEC climate disclosure rules. Disclosing your greenhouse gas emissions is part of that for a lot of companies, and that is going to require very stringent data management processes. And then there's steps up requirements around assurance related to that as well. So the data quality is going to need to continue to improve over time to keep up with that. And then even on the more voluntary side of things, frameworks like GRESB are really moving towards more asset level data being the driving force behind those, and increasing focus on the scoring side. So if you want to keep your scores and rankings up there, focusing on that asset level data is really the way to do it. And then just from ESG reporting side as well, telling your story in your ESG report, having those metrics and stats to back it up is a really critical part of making sure you've got that confidence within the statements that you're making.
Perfect. Yeah. And Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say much left over after everyone's already kind of touched all the points, but I think really I focus a lot on process improvement, continuous improvement all the time. So if you don't have that benchmark, that base foundation, that base number to start from, you don't know what changes you've made, right? People are always asking, well, what's the ROI on this project? Well, if you don't know what you started with, if you don't know how much energy you're utilizing at a certain building and you make an implementation, there's no way to measure how much that might have changed or affected your outcome of what you're hoping to achieve. So whether or not you would apply that to the next project or do something different, there's no way to gauge that. So I think really making sure you have a base foundation for that benchmark across all your portfolios, you understand what that metric is telling you, is really key. And then it just ties into everything else that they've expressed, especially with compliance and reporting, making sure that you're having integrity. And we've seen over the course of this last year, there's been a lot of lawsuits about the integrity of data. So making sure that it's really accurately benchmarked and you have an understanding of what you're disclosing.
Definitely. Yeah, and I agree too. It's like, we need to gather that data first, and then we can use it to do all the things that everyone's talking about here. So, to start with that piece is like, we're still facing some challenges with obtaining sustainability data. So what are some of the things that we can do today to alleviate some of those challenges? and how do we gather more data, essentially capture more data coverages for the buildings that we work on or everyone else works on. So Jonathan, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start this time. So I think part of the hard part is really getting the value add and getting people to engage in that concept of collecting the data and realize it's not just so we can see what a building or what a tenant is doing as part of their usage and feel like an invasion of privacy. But there's a lot of other metrics that go into those numbers. So trying to gain that access, especially triple net properties, is very difficult. And then there's a lot of regulations and regions where they've implemented direct utility connections, aggregate connections, but there's a vast majority of the United States that still, we don't have that capability yet. So of course, there are other options, new technologies coming out, but that's one of the hard part. And I think the other difficult part is when you're educating property teams or tenants to input data into Energy Star or into a platform. Right, there's a myriad of different electric or really utility companies. I know there's probably over 3,000-4,000 electric companies alone that have various types of bills and formats, and not everyone understands what numbers they should be putting in. So it's also an educational standpoint as well.
Brenna, do you want to chime in?
So, for Jonathan, so well done there. I think the way I think about it is utility data is ugly and it's dirty, right? It's hard to get a hold of. When you get it, there can be gaps in the meters, there can be errors. And even with automatic feed, if a login gets updated or there's an automatic requirement to update the password, connections get disconnected and it takes effort. So it just can be hard to deal with. And I think, increasingly for the clients, that we've been working with, they want help around that piece because that's not, they need it. They know it needs to be accurate. It needs to be valid, but it's really hard work and they'd rather outsource that work. I think the other point that I would make about this, about challenges, and this builds on Jonathan, your point about triple net leases or leases where the tenant pays for the energy bill directly to the utility. So they control the meter, if you will. So you don't see the bill, you don't know what that consumption was, and you don't necessarily have a right to get access to that data without the tenant's buy-in and approval. But what we've seen is when you engage with tenants around, hey, this is important that we get access to this data because maybe we have a compliance requirement or a duty to disclose it, which is often covered in most leases. Or, hey, we're trying to look at performance opportunity improvements and we need it as part of our reporting. We find that tenants are willing to share, but sometimes they see it as proprietary. So bigger tenants see that data as proprietary. So it's a nuanced discussion, but increasingly they are, willing to share if you take, the time to engage with them on. But those are some of the challenges that we're certainly seeing.
Yeah, definitely. And I always think like the data gathering process, sometimes it might be more of an art than a science too. Like there's so many different, ways that we can gather the data. As mentioned, some of the ways like working with tenants and a tenant discussion, educating the tenants, that's more of an art there. Working with the utility companies, aggregating that data, getting automated pushes into Energy Star or wherever other platforms, that's another sort of a way there. And then, working with different types of metering systems, installing smart meters, that's another way. So there's a lot of different opportunities and ways to get that information and get the data. There's still issues around it, but sometimes it is more of a educational component as well. So, as we gather more data and we're able to collect some of this data now, we are faced with some of these issues, like, data quality checks. Data quality, I guess, is one of the things that we talked about, data issues and accuracy. So what are some like best practices for data quality checks and accuracy? And then how often should the data be like checked and updated on a consistent basis? So Jonathan, since you're like deep into the data, let's start with you.
How often should it be updated? So I would love to see it updated like as soon as you get the invoice or anything like that. But the reality is it's not going to happen to that extent. I would say best practice, do it quarterly, right? Because when there are, errors that you might have inputted from, a missed typo, or you might have added a new meter and you didn't put in the appropriate units associated with that particular meter, and you didn't catch it. Maybe you're newer to doing that process, or you're just in a hurry and things just pass by. Having that chance for someone to review it on a semi-regular basis is much easier to realize what happened, so you can refresh it, rather than being a year, maybe a year and a half later, and you're like, hey, why was this, number so high? What's the discrepancy here? Why is this inconsistent with the rest of the numbers? Or maybe for another purpose or another perspective is the property management team or whoever it was that did that entry has shifted, or they may not have the records of that data entry point. So I think doing it on a more regular cadence, such as quarterly, is ideal, but at the very minimum annually.
Got it. And what are some like best practices you would say for data quality checks? Like what are some things that people should look out for when they look at the data and see like potential issues that could arise?
Yeah, definitely outliers is what, sounds like a general terminology, right? But if it's like maybe, 20%, maybe a little bit lower, or 15%, depending on the time of the year, that's a good threshold to be evaluating as far as your consumption change, maybe from you could do a month over month or a year over year comparison, but just realize that there are influences upon some of those changes. It could be tenant change. There could be potentially there's a new meter installed, something wasn't working correctly, you've worked leaks, or you've done more efficient projects throughout the year. So that's one component of it. Always looking for duplicate entries. A lot of times we see that, or if maybe you keep just entering the same value over and over and over just to kind of make it look good and get people off your back. If you're just reporting to report, as someone who's really looking for data quality purposes, that's something we want to make sure we're evaluating. And then I would say, just looking at the industry, there's a lot of resources. Energy Star has a myriad. They have one site where you can actually look at all the kind of average uses of building types, and just seeing how does your building energy use intensity compare to maybe the average that you're seeing on there. If it's substantially high, maybe take a closer look and evaluate what are some of the potential indicators, or why is it so much higher? Or maybe you are duplicating particular numbers because you're not reading the invoice appropriately. But that's always a good benchmark.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. Anyone else want to chime in? No? It looks like. Oh, okay. Yeah, it looks like Jonathan covered it pretty well. And, definitely I agree on some of those approaches, using Energy Star, the benchmarks, Data Explorer, Energy Star Data Explorer to utilize that. There's gaps and overlaps that's identified. So yeah, once you get all that data, look at it and, evaluate it. There's always sometimes like a story to tell with that data. Jonathan mentioned if there's an increase, it could actually be right if you see like a 30%, but you have to tell the whole story behind that data and why there's an increase. So yeah, and so once you gather the data, you check the data looks great, or you fix the data, and now it looks great again. What are some like the key performance metrics or key indicators that you can create with that data set? And what are some of the ones specifically related to the commercial real estate industry? So Katie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I'm talking about KPIs, I like to break it down into those 3 buckets of E, S, and G around environmental, social, and governance, to make sure your program is well-rounded and you're sort of covering all of those buckets. So I'll start on the environmental side. That is where we see the vast majority of the metrics coming from. And I'll say the big 4 are always energy, water, waste, and greenhouse gas emissions. Those are pretty universal across the board, although the way people look at them varies wildly across the board. So you can look at year-over-year performance. You can look at a goal against a baseline year. You can look at absolute metrics. You can look at intensity-based metrics. So depending on the story you're trying to tell, or where you need to disclose that information, is going to dictate what way you want to display those KPIs. Also, on the environmental side, we see a lot of folks talking about green building certifications as a big one in that bucket. And then there's a lot of, I'll say, less universal environmental metrics that can be used to sort of tell your specific story, or may resonate more particularly with certain fund strategies. So thinking things like, what's the average walk score across the fund? So that's a metric that shows you how walkable a site is to other amenities. It could be access to green space. It could be something about tracking specific energy efficiency projects, like how many properties have upgraded LED lights, things like that. So the options are really endless there based on the story you're looking to tell on the environmental side. On the social side, metrics often around things like diversity of staff or retention of staff are important to tell. And also at the property level, things like tenant or resident satisfaction can be really important to share. Again, always more specific things to help tell your story. So it could be things like volunteer hours that you're looking to share there, or percentage of minority or women-owned businesses that you're supporting through your properties. So again, specific metrics you can use on the social side. And then finally, governance side, smaller bucket of things usually tracked there, but it could be things like looking at the number of ESG incidents and making sure you're tracking that. Other safety metrics fall within that bucket. Diversity of your board of directors is a governance metric, and then looking at things like pay equity across the board. So quite a lot of different options out there. There has been some efforts to sort of standardize metrics across organizations like INREV, and others are looking at ways to standardize some metrics, but there is an opportunity there to really tell your story and be authentic to your organization with the metrics that you're choosing to report on and display.
That's definitely very comprehensive. We covered a whole range of metrics and data points to collect, not just energy, water, waste, et cetera, but all the social and governance metrics as well. Some of the work that we do is helping clients with their investor DDQs, due diligence questionnaires. So our clients receive questions on ESG metrics and data points from their investors, and so we help answer some of those questions as well from the data point perspective. So I guess Brady, what do you see are some of the key metrics that we answer for DDQs?
Yeah, well, I think Katie really nailed it with her last response, and a lot of this is just building on that. So there are, the big E's in particular that she mentioned, and also those S and G's. Just kind of want to iterate that there isn't really a standard format. It's a lot of similar data, but sometimes presented in a slightly different way, and kind of just highlighting the idea there that it's important to have your data stored in a way that will allow you to manipulate it into any of these formats that are required pretty easily. The other thing that I kind of want to highlight is, the idea that the only constant is change. So when we, look back at the investor data requests that we were getting, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I would say, sustainability as a whole, it's gotten a little bit broader, and it's also gotten a little bit deeper in some areas. So I think in the last couple of years, we've seen people asking for things like your portfolio average strand year, or just wanting to get in, and that obviously being to CREM, or obvious to me, maybe not obvious to everyone, or trying to understand exposures to BPS penalties, things along those lines. We've seen an uptick in people or investors trying to understand exposure to physical risks. So that could be something like the percent of gross asset value exposed to high or very high acute risks or chronic risks. So things like floods, hurricanes, heat stress, drought. A newer one that we've also seen is energy source information. So not just looking at your energy use or your greenhouse gas emissions, but trying to understand what percentage of the energy that your properties use is coming from electricity versus coming from on-site fossil fuels. This kind of builds a little bit on what Jonathan was saying about Energy Star Data Explorer, where you can see, how much does the average property, or does a peer property, how much of their energy do they get from fossil fuels versus electricity? And the idea being, properties that use a lot of fossil fuels are going to require additional investment to decarbonize. So it can kind of be a way of ascertaining risk. Yeah, I think that kind of covers what I wanted to talk about there, but happy to hear from others about anything that I might have missed.
Brandon, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll pick on that. First of all, crushed it. Katie and Brady, well done. I really would emphasize that I agree with what you said. I would also build on the comment. INREV is a way for certain investors to standardize the questions they ask. I just have not seen that be a strong coalescence around that yet, right? It's a goal and it's a good one, but I think at the end of the day, investors want to be their own special snowflake and have, certain objectives. And I think Some of that's driven around the frameworks that Katie talked about. If you're in Europe and you're aligning with the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, you may have different criteria based on the characteristics you've committed to promote, and you're going to ask for data in different ways. The other thing that I would reinforce, because I love that Katie broke it out between the E, S, and G buckets, is the way I like to think about social metrics is those are just different forms of engagement. You engage with your community through volunteerism or charitable donations. And as Katie said, what are the stories you want to tell? And the other last comment is that, again, you engage with tenants and customers through surveys, whether that's at a hotel, multifamily property, or an office building. But the other point last point that I would make on this is on governance. You know, for publicly held companies, this has been a strength for many, many years and has been a key focus. And I think a lot of the privately held companies are realizing, due to SEC requirements and others, that it's increasingly important to think about policy and process, training, those governance guidelines, not just having a policy, but having a process to maintain it. And those are things increasingly we're seeing investors ask about.
That's great points. And we definitely seen, you know, the questions from investors have evolved and have gotten sometimes in a wider spread, but also more specific in a sense as well. So, but oftentimes the questions that they ask is more so not related to individual buildings, but more so at a portfolio level. So they're asking about funds, you know, what is your funds KPIs in terms of EUIs or, you know, energy use intensity, water use intensity. But the tricky part is that when we're aggregating and rolling up a lot of these data sets, it comes in various formats, and there's a lack of standardized protocols. And the different data sets have different, you know, sort of metrics and units around it. So what are some of the challenges revolving around portfolio level data and the data aggregation component of that? So Jonathan, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I can do that. I think we've touched a little bit about it already. It's just really, how are you telling that story as a major component? What are you expressing whenever you respond to a question like that? You know, if we had whole building data on every single building that we had in our portfolio, we knew all the metrics for 100%, and it was consistent across the board, it'd be an easy story to tell, right? But the reality is you have these mixed coverages. You have one building which has, you know, just the, you know, landlord area electricity, but you have the whole building of gas consumption recorded. So what's that intensity? How do you justify it, right? There could be a tenant that's, maybe the rest of that building is a data center, so it really is using a lot of electricity consumption. It's hard to really gauge that. So I think when you're trying to tell that story is understanding the disclosures that you're expressing around the portfolio. Usually I would suggest talking in terms of full building metrics particularly, and put that separate aside from maybe your other metrics. The other metrics are important, so don't get me wrong, right? You still need to disclose, you know, what you have as some of your absolute metrics. So that is also another baseline that you can measure against. But making sure you're distinguishing what you're relaying in coordination or in tandem with those data points that you're disclosing. So from a portfolio perspective, just making sure that you know, talk about your whole building, talk about your absolute, and then when you're looking at your improvements, understanding what influences may have changed, right? Because absolute can't be the only metric that you're talking about, because there's constant change within portfolios. A lot of these portfolios, especially if it's a short-term hold or value add fund strategy where there's constant change in the portfolio and you're trying to look at a comparison of 5 years, well, you could have already had a whole turn of the whole portfolio, which is a completely different data set. So making sure that those components are taken into account when you're disclosing them is really important. And then what's the meaning or what's the impact of the analysis? When you disclose that, what's going to be the reaction either from your manager, from your investors, from the DDQ response that you respond to? How is that positively or negatively impacting the story? So I think taking that into consideration is really key. But there's a lot of components. It's not a black and white answer. You really have to understand it. It's the same thing, like we had this question the other day. Hey, go ahead and give me your year-end data. I was like, your year-end data. I was like, okay, we have part of your portfolio hasn't quite finished the last quarter of data. So do you want me to give you the snapshot from January to say October, or do you want me to do the last 12 months, which is representative of a full year's worth of data? Granted, it's not 100% accurate of 2023, but neither is a partial, 9 months worth of data set. So that's like a quick example of how you have to make sure that you're giving the right connotation to what you're disclosing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's always like asking what type of data are you looking for? Are you looking for intensity data? Are you looking for absolute? Do you only want whole building data? Do you want common area data as well? Do you want us to include exterior? So there's a lot of different ways to look at that. And one thing that we always notice too is like when you are providing that data, there's always like an asterisk that goes with it. It's like, here's the little text language on what that data is and what's included in that data and what's not included. So everyone knows what we're reporting on. So. Yeah, great points. And so, we've gotten the data, we've done the data quality checks, we created the KPIs and metrics for reporting purposes. So throughout this whole process, what is the benefit of having the human element to the data gathering and data processes? And we talk, a lot of people mentioning data automation using some AI to do that. But what is a human element that can support all this data collection, process, reporting, gathering, etc.? Brenna, do you want to take that one?
For first sort of touch on this question, because I think it often gets lost in the dialogue, is that the big value proposition for the human intervention is really the interpretation of the data. And it speaks to kind of what you were talking about, Jonathan. You could get somebody sends you a data file that says this is for 2023. But is it accurate? Does it have everything in it? Does it have footnotes? Are we missing a month or two or more, et cetera? But taking it a step, further is we can get into this data blindness when there's so much data that it becomes easy to miss what are the key performance indicators we want to focus on, A, and B, sometimes if something's off, i.e. there's a big variance, again, that we touched on earlier, where something is dramatically lower for a given weekend or a given month of the year. It could be because a big tenant moved out. Well, the human influences, yeah, I know the big tenant moved out. And so, yeah, we're down 10%, but we lost 10 to 15% of our occupancy. And I'm like, yep, check, there's no problem. There's no research. We understand that makes sense. Or, hey, we've used, in getting into more interval data, notice that, hey, why is data super high use on a Saturday, which is unusual? The human knows there was a big event, a big tenant event or a property event on the Saturday. So that understanding and interpretation is a huge value proposition. I think the other big thing is, as we touched on, is around engagement, because you don't have 100% access to, warehouse distribution buildings, retail buildings. There's all kinds of uses where you don't have whole building access. And so having engagement with tenants it's a people thing, right? And when you have a relationship in particular with those tenants, often, like I said, they will be willing to share data if you could explain to them why is it important. We need to not only do compliance and reporting, but oh, by the way, I'm going to use it to try to help improve performance and save you some money. Generally, tenants lean into that and want to do it. So I think those are some of the reasons that we see the human proposition is really part of the value proposition.
Thank you. Yeah, so I guess we're taking the audience here through this journey of gathering the data, doing the data quality checks, creating KPIs and reporting, and then adding a layer of the human component to it. So then once we have all this combined and grouped, then the next question is how to use that data to drive action. What do you do with it to help you in your sustainability journey? So Brady, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that you end up doing in order to ensure that you're making informed next steps. I think, first and foremost, you obviously can't review raw data and then understand, what properties to target for improvements or to really understand what your next steps are. That's when you need to have more sophisticated metrics. So things like energy use intensity or carbon use intensity. But it's also not just those metrics, it's understanding how you're going to use them. So it could be a comparison of, again, a given metric versus a peer or a median of that property type. Or you could be taking kind of your current performance and comparing it against what your target performance or what your goal performance is. So an example might be a property that's predicted to face fines by local law 97. You're going to be looking at your carbon use intensity, and you're going to try to see, how much do I need to reduce my carbon emissions in 5 years or in 10 years or in 15 years? And that's going to inform when you might get an energy audit or look at purchasing RECs. So there are a number of different analyses that you need to do, and maybe a little bit of introspection, understanding your company's goals, understanding the goals for this property or for this fund. But really, at the end of the day, it is kind of a lot of individual pieces of logic that you can do some simple math on, and then really understand and make very informed decisions on what types of insights you're going to want to make.
Anyone else want to chime in?
As well, because I think Brady, again, hit some really important points. It's also tied to this: how do we better visualize the data? So take these huge, massive data sets and then visualize those into performance metrics. And Energy Star is one example how that can take months or years of electric, gas, steam, all kinds of different energy uses, and distill that down into a kBTU per square foot measure, and then weather normalize it, and occupancy normalize it, and building type normalize it to give you a score between them. You now suddenly can take all that data that could be a year or more and visualize it into a number. 75 and above is a top performer in the marketplace, top 25%. But I can also compare that metric this year versus last year, this year versus my portfolio properties. So it starts becoming a better way to understand and visualize the data. And if we can focus on the right metrics, which again are going to be different for different properties, different portfolios, different ownerships, and different investment strategies, then we can have a better, again, more decision useful data sets to be able to really take the right action at the right time and plan it well in advance. And that's another thing that we see clients really appreciate, is the ability to plan, especially as it relates to compliance or climate risk. Can't do it all today or all in 1 year, but if we can come up with a thoughtful task force on climate related financial disclosure, TCFD aligned program, we can do it in a more thoughtful, organized way that can also save us money and reduce risk. And that's kind of what we're seeing.
Yeah, definitely. And, I think we're running out of time. I just want to leave some time for questions from the audience. So audience members, if you do have questions, please put it in now. But I just want to do one more question for the whole group here. So what do you guys think is the future of sustainability data? Oh, we'll just jump around the room. Who wants to
Jump in first to get it going. Here is, I think we're going to go from kind of, Jonathan talked about, quarterly, annually, even monthly data input, that we're going to get to true real-time data. And that will take metering and technology, but I think that's where it's moving. And it's when we use the energy is going to be more important. So time of day will be more important. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of utilities look at energy storage, battery solutions paired with renewables as a way to manage these types of things. But we know that there are software solutions that can sit on top of a building automation system and literally 100 times a second evaluate the performance as it relates to energy consumption, load, weather, humidity, and optimize so that you not only save money, but you also make occupants more comfortable. And I think that's where we're going. And so having the right perspective on this and the technology to help support that will be increasingly important.
Brady or Katie? Brady, I guess you're first.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Love that, Brenna. And it's something that I've been thinking about for a while, which is, for greenhouse gas emissions calculations, we're starting to see interest in more time of use types calculations, or, looking at, the emissions factor from the grid at that time. So are you using energy when the grid is 100% solar, or are you using energy when the grid is a lot dirtier? So I think the main thing is, and it's a little bit frightening to think about, is we might be talking about a lot more data when we're talking about, 8,760 hours of the year, et cetera, versus monthly or annual types of numbers. So I think the future of sustainability data is a lot of data. Hopefully it's not all in Excel.
Agreed.
Yep, totally agree on that one for sure. If we can move out of Excel, hopefully. But from my side on the reporting things, I think that the regulatory requirements are not going to slow down anytime soon, but I do think they're going to continue to evolve. We've seen pushback lately, but we've also seen these regulatory bodies taking feedback from the users. Particularly, I'm thinking SFDR right now opened up a consultation the end of last year to get some feedback on how SFDR was working. So I think we will expect to see these things evolve over time and that to drive the sustainability data that's really going to be necessary. And then even though Brenna thinks that we're not going to standardize all the metrics, I think she's probably right there. I do think there have been some successful efforts to combine different disclosure formats. I know ISSB now oversees the IFRS standard and also has SASB under their umbrella and has taken TCFD in. So I'm hopeful that we'll see continued moves to really consolidate what's being expected from a reporting standpoint to make these metrics a little bit clearer and easier to compare across the board. So we can have some of that actionable insights.
Yeah, I think the other piece of it too is these regulations are becoming more stringent and people are getting scrutinized a lot more for their data, is really having a way to tie back to where that source of the data came from, right? So if it came from a utility bill, someone did manually enter it, then you actually have that notated. You have a place to store that information. If it's coming from, you know, maybe a shadow meter, for example, or something that you've tied on to that pipe or whatever the case may be, that's sending the information, that you know where it's coming from, you know the calculations on how it's happening, right? So you basically have your documentation, so to speak, to prove it out to anyone that comes out and questioning it, right? I know you've seen in the past where people come in, audits are never like 3 months later, they're usually a year, 2 years later down the road. And do you still have that information collected in a reasonable spot that you can, you know, point to it and just basically hand them the book, say, here's my information, go ahead, tear it apart. I know it's sound. So I think that's going to be the next level. I'd say the only other part that we're still continuously trying to evaluate of what to analyze or how to track it efficiently is the new, I should say the growing single family home funds, right? No one wants to benchmark every single 600 single buildings for one small portion of assets that you purchase, but it is becoming a larger portion of their assets. So how do we capture that data appropriately, but also not invade the privacy component of each of those individual habitants of the homes?
Where we're seeing like more of like sort of a funneling of two different separations of data. Like one is it's going to get more and more granular. You're going to start getting it down to the meter level, looking at all those different ways to verify that the data is correct. But then at the opposite end, you're getting it more and more at the higher level and aggregating all that data for reporting purposes for all these compliance and reporting requirements as well. So it's interesting how it's getting more specific and more high level at the same time. So yeah, so let's jump into the questions. Let's see, we do have one question here. Is there a push to standardizing EUI and carbon conversions away from basic requirements and regulations, like Local Law 97, the BEPS, so away from portfolio managers' volatile CBEX algorithms? So I guess, okay, to clarify, moving regulations to standardized EUI and greenhouse gas conversions away from portfolio managers' CBEX. So I think maybe Brady, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard of one, and I'm not positive if I'm going to answer this entirely correctly, but like when I'm thinking about like the building performance regulations, you know, I would love to see more standardization there versus kind of every single regulation having different metrics and different requirements. I think that's it's very complicated and very confusing. But again, yeah, I really haven't heard much. I did hear with the state of Colorado passing their ordinance after the city of Denver's, I believe there's a little bit of a push to have those two be aligned, but that's still not helpful for, you know, people that own portfolios nationally.
comments
Yeah.
to say that the Institute for Market Transformation and their work on coming up with a standardized approach for building energy performance standards or BPS standards. So they're trying to work on that, but I mean the train is off the station a little bit, right? Because there's so many jurisdictions that already have them either in place or they're enabled and they're setting rules. But agree it would be helpful to have some more standardizations around building performance standards. For sure.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that as well. So the next question is, how do you all leverage emerging technologies such as AI, machine learning, blockchain to utilize data to optimize energy efficiency in decentralized energy systems? Ooh,
I think
tricky
that
one.
might be a question for you, Chung. That sounds like more of a strategic partnership type response.
Yeah, I mean, it could go back to me. So, for us, we evaluate and look at all different types of technologies and services, and from a perspective of, how does it support in the work that we do and for our clients. So whether that's using artificial intelligence or blockchain, we're open to all different ways that we can capture as much data as possible. So some of the things that we're starting to see now is automated data capture, but then another piece is taking that data and then providing automated energy conservation measures out of that as well. So instead of having people to go on site and do energy audits, the systems can actually project out based on the building's characteristics, energy usage information, emissions, that they can project out what types of conservation measures could be potential opportunities for some of these buildings. So those are some of the things that I see that's starting to come out using the AI machine learning component to sort of structure energy efficiency measures for buildings with limited amount of data, and then you have more layers and more layers of data on top of that to get more and more precise level of conservation measures to help reduce energy emissions at the building. So okay, so I don't see any other questions. I guess we have a couple minutes. Maybe we do one more question that I prepared. So what are some like the tools and resources that we think are like helpful in the sustainability data world in general? So like, what are some of the tools that we use, for instance, to help support our work, and that some of the audience members can look into as well to support their work? Jonathan?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So it really comes around, I would say, standardization, rigor, tested methodologies is the base of it, right? Because if I'm doing a calculation, I'm doing some certain checks and Brady's doing some other ones, and there's inconsistency between the two of us, and the output's always going to be incorrect, right? So we also need to make sure that there's validity to how we're doing those analysis. So having a standardized process is what I would suggest is kind of being that first and initial step. And it really is going to help the support to how you finalize all those calculations. The other component of it, we've touched on the value of the in-person analytics apart from the technology and how important that is. So I think utilizing a sustainability firm or someone to do that analytics component of it is really, really key. There still are plenty of platforms that offer technology that are supportive, right? Seeing the graphics displayed appropriately, how you portray those is another key component, but people doing the analytical work and finding out those variances and telling the story appropriately rather than an AI. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love ChatGPT. It tells me some great information, but it's also really, really good at telling me something that's incorrect, and it looks fantastic on paper. So we don't want that to be the story. Really, really want there to be a real story to it. And then I would say, having people to go out and really who understand maybe more of a technical spec of buildings and doing the ASHRAE level audit, something to that granular level to really be on site and evaluating things is kind of your next step to really start to get to that improvement aspect of it. Then we kind of talked a little bit about, Chung, is with the AI component and doing some modeling, so to speak. Take those responses that you're getting from an energy audit and saying, how can we apply that? What's the potential outcome? What's the potential savings of the portfolios of your buildings? So I think there's a couple of different components of it. There are tools and resources, but it's not just like, this is the only tool you got to use. Like there's multiple components that really make up your story.
Definitely. Yeah, we only have a couple minutes left, and I just want to shoot out a quick fun question to everyone, just like quick round robin. Like, if you have the power to resolve one thing about sustainability data, what would it be? So anything that you can. So let's do it quickly. Brenna, let's start with you. Or if you need time to think, sounds like you're taking a thought to that question. Maybe let's start with Brady.
Well, I think the easy one that probably everyone would say is just being able to get whole building data broken out by owner and tenant for every building in the world. Like, I think that's what we all want. So I dare someone to try to top that.
I'll go. just for fun and just to see how it competes. I want the data updated right now. So as soon as I need to have the data set and someone says, hey, give me that metric as of today, boom, it's all there for every single building that I need to disclose.
And I'll take that one step farther and say I want it to be in the hands of the people it needs to be to make actionable change immediately. So that's the next step.
You guys all crushed it. The only thing I would say is just helping making sure people understand the value proposition. It's just stunning to me. There's still a lot of people that don't understand. If you get more efficient and we reduce waste, so that should save us money, and that should be a good thing. And so to me, that's fundamentally what it comes down to, is to really people understand the business case. Yes, it's going to help the environment for sure. It's going to help people, but it's also going to be good for business. And I just think that's a compelling message.
Well, that's the end of the discussion, and thank you all to all the panelists participating, providing your excellent insights and experiences on sustainability data. So thank you to all the audience members for joining and listening as well. So hopefully it was helpful and insightful for all of you. We do have a next webinar, so stay tuned for it. It's going to be on June 12th at 11 a.m. Central. Unlock a Wealth of Data, a platform that meets the need for commercial real estate. So keep an eye out for that. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Yeah.
Thanks, Todd.
Bye.
Thanks, John.